before we finish the last few topics of this chapter, I want to make a couple of points that I was not able to make in the prior video. Namely, that we all know that oxygen travels attached to the hemoglobin molecule within the red blood cells. It was also mentioned in the previous video that carbon dioxide also travels attached to hemoglobin. However, what was not made clear was the fact that carbon dioxide travels attached to the protein portion of the hemoglobin. We know that oxygen travels attached to the iron atom within the heme molecule. But just to be clear, that carbon dioxide, when it does travel attached to hemoglobin, it travels attached to the globin, or the protein portion of the hemoglobin. All right, so our discussions up until this point have brought us to a summary of some of the important points regarding respiration and gas exchange. And this image on page 839 helps to summarize a number of those points. And so we will take a look at this big picture here for the next few minutes. So pulmonary ventilation helps to bring oxygen into the lungs. Because of the changing volume and pressure within the lungs, that helps to draw air in, and some of that air contains oxygen. The oxygen molecules then enter the alveoli, and because of the partial pressure of oxygen, which is about 104 millimeters of mercury, the oxygen is able to diffuse into the blood and attach to hemoglobin within the red blood cells. The oxygen molecules then are transported by hemoglobin in the red blood cells to the tissues. And so the oxygen then is then transferred to the tissue cells where it can be used to make ATP. After production of ATP, the cells generate some carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is able to diffuse into the blood, where some of it travels freely in the plasma. A portion of it travels attached to hemoglobin. And as that carbon dioxide gas makes its way around to the lungs again, then the carbon dioxide can then diffuse out of the blood into the alveoli, where it can be released into the atmosphere. Now, a couple of points that I want to make here with regards to this gas exchange is the fact that where the gases are exchanged between the alveoli and the blood, this has a specific name. This is called external respiration. So where the gases are exchanged between the alveoli and the blood, we refer to that as external respiration. Where the gases are exchanged between the blood and the tissue cells, that has a different name. That is called internal respiration. So technically, the lungs are only responsible for external respiration. Once the gases get into the blood, then it's all up to the partial pressures in order to exchange those gases between the tissue cells and the blood. So, this larger process involves partial pressures, Dalton's law, Henry's law, and pulmonary ventilation involves Boyle's law, as we've discussed previously. The last topic that I want to focus on now has to do with ventilation and pH control. The respiratory system has an important function in terms of helping to regulate the pH of blood and body fluids. And it does so through respiration, through pulmonary ventilation. And it involves negative feedback loops. So let's take a look at this diagram here, which helps to illustrate changes in pH and the role of the respiratory system. So up at the top of the diagram here, we have our little meter, which is measuring the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And as we know, carbon dioxide has an important role in terms of acid production and therefore changing pH within our blood and body fluids. And as it turns out, carbon dioxide is an important main driver of respiratory function. So as levels of carbon dioxide go up, which also helps to increase hydrogen ions or acids, that triggers a response in chemoreceptors within the body. Some of those chemoreceptors are located in the central nervous system. There are other chemoreceptors that are also located in the peripheral nervous system. And when levels of CO2 go up or levels of acids go up, that triggers the respiratory centers in the medulla and the pons to increase respiratory rate and depth. And when we increase respiratory rate and respiratory depth, that's referred to as hyperventilation. So higher levels of CO2, higher levels of acids trigger the respiratory centers to get busy, breathing faster, and also helping to increase respiratory depth. So the hyperventilation is designed to promote loss of CO2. So with that hyperventilation, we're losing more CO2, there's less opportunity to make acids, and if everything's working well, that should bring us back to our sort of normal range of values for PCO2 and hydrogen ion. So here we have another example of a negative feedback loop. CO2 levels increase within the blood and body fluids, but then the system reverses those levels and brings them down. And that's basically the definition of a negative feedback loop, as we know. All right, so let's take a look at the opposite situation here. Again, we have a negative feedback loop, except for this situation, we have decreasing levels of PCO2. When levels of CO2 go down, there's not as much acid being made. So the chemoreceptors detect those lowering levels of CO2 and then activate the respiratory centers in the medulla and the pons to, instead of increasing respiration, instead decrease respiration or cause hypoventilation. So by slowing down the respiratory rate and depth, that causes the lungs to hold on to more CO2, so they're not exhaling as much CO2. And so retaining CO2 in the blood causes the pH to go up or become more alkaline as a result. And if all things are working well, that gets us to kind of our normal range of PCO2. So what we've seen in these last two examples of feedback loops and the relation between PCO2, acids, and respiratory rate and depth. So what we've seen in these last two feedback loops is that as the levels of carbon dioxide change, the system compensates in some way, either to lower or raise those levels of CO2. And the lungs have an important job of adjusting levels of CO2 very quickly. Now, as I mentioned previously, one of the main drivers of respiratory functions is the level of CO2 in the blood. Levels of oxygen do assist with adjusting respiratory rate and depth. However, carbon dioxide has a bigger role. If you recall the partial pressures of both oxygen and carbon dioxide, the levels of oxygen are far higher in terms of their partial pressure compared to CO2. So, small changes in oxygen levels are not going to have as much an effect as changes in CO2. Because there's less CO2 present, small changes in the levels of CO2 are going to have a larger effect. So, in a basic way, CO2 is an important driver of respiratory functions. So, let's consider the role of the respiratory system here and its relationship to the pH of blood and body fluids. As you have learned about previously, this chemical reaction is very, very important and one of the main reactions that help to adjust and manage the pH levels in the blood and body fluids. And if certain respiratory diseases take hold, that can alter the pH of blood and body fluids. Certain respiratory diseases, particularly those that are of an obstructive nature, for example, pneumonia, emphysema, asthma, bronchitis, they can all produce a change in pH, which we refer to as respiratory acidosis. These diseases cause a retention in CO2 within the blood and body fluids. These diseases also cause a reduction in the overall respiratory rate. So, as levels of CO2 start to build up, that condition is called hypercapnia. So in hypercapnia, when levels of CO2 go up, that causes a reduction in the pH level. And the compensation for that situation is to increase respiratory rate and depth. The converse, or the kind of the opposite of respiratory acidosis, is respiratory alkalosis. In this situation, you have an increase in respiratory rate that's causing CO2 to leave the body faster. And as a result of that breathing off of CO2, that changes the levels of CO2 in the blood to produce hypocapnia. With hypocapnia, that would cause an increase in the pH levels. So in other words, the blood would become more alkaline as a result. The respiratory compensation, or the respiratory control for respiratory alkalosis, is a slowing down of the breathing. So by slowing the breathing down, that helps to retain CO2, which compensates for those lower CO2 levels that were happening previously. And hopefully that will bring those levels of CO2 back up. Conditions that can cause respiratory alkalosis are shock, trauma, even emotional anxiety. So between these two respiratory conditions, respiratory acidosis is more common, whereas respiratory alkalosis is not as common. And in fact, if somebody is having some emotional anxiety where they are breathing faster because of something that is maybe very upsetting, one of the sort of treatments to help that person is to give them a paper bag to breathe into. By rebreathing the air in the paper bag, that helps the person to breathe in more CO2 to help offset the hypocapnia that is sometimes produced. So when the nature of the illness is respiratory in nature, and that alters the pH. We can refer to those respiratory disorders or imbalances as respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. And later on, when we study more information about fluid electrolyte and pH balance, we'll learn about a couple of other types of pH imbalances, namely metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. So here's a little visual that summarizes a number of these obstructive disorders that I mentioned previously. The group of obstructive disorders is referred to as COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. A few main ones that are mentioned here in this diagram are chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma. In chronic bronchitis, secretions from mucus glands fill the airways, and accumulation of these secretions causes an obstruction in the airway, which produce a hyperinflation of the alveoli. So air gets in, but it doesn't get out. So it is the result of excessive mucus production. And sometimes this is bacterial and can be cleared up with a round of antibiotics. Another type of COPD is emphysema. And emphysema is a chronic disorder. It usually is the result of smoking, but not always. And in emphysema, the alveoli become stretched out and enlarged. As a result of that stretching, you lose surface area. And when you have loss of surface area, you have loss of efficient gas exchange. We talked about surface area previously. So unfortunately, in folks that have emphysema, that surface area and those small alveoli cannot be regained. A third type of COPD is asthma. And there are many, many different types of triggers for asthma. But mainly in asthma, you have a buildup of excessive secretions that obstruct the airways. The airways also become edematous or filled with edema. As a result, the alveoli can also hyperinflate, and so air gets in, but it can't get out. And so that just makes it very difficult to breathe and also helps to impair the gas exchange process. So these are just a few of the examples of respiratory disorders that can cause respiratory acidosis if not managed well. So the last thing that I want to have you think about here is a question regarding respiratory function. And the question is, considering what we have discussed about oxygen and carbon dioxide, how is it that someone can deliver rescue breathing to another individual? All right. I hope you've had a little bit of time to think about that. And although it is true that we exhale CO2, it is also true that we also exhale oxygen. The air that we take in is composed of oxygen as well as a little bit of carbon dioxide. However, not all of the oxygen that we breathe in makes it all the way down into our alveoli. So some of that oxygen is lingering in the bronchial passageways and in the trachea. So if we were to give somebody rescue breathing, the air that we exhale does contain some oxygen, of course, which will be helpful to an individual who needs rescue breathing. This concludes my presentation of Chapter 21